I think I might have won the prize for the most pretentious title on the presentation. So I've given myself a challenge of making that actually a reasonable thing to put on the opening slide. We are in the business of talking about the big picture. I mean, nothing can be bigger than the future of work. And so I've got to go through a few points before I can get on to what I think can inform the big picture. And I feel a bit like the flight attendant, at the start of a flight who offers you kind of important information, but it's really boring and you want to get on with it. You don't want to know about the exit, the seat belts and so forth. So I've got to go through these things before I kind of start the talk proper. Autonomization, because I'm sure there's a few people in this room today who are kind of really beguiled by the possibilities of information and communications technology. And I often counsel against such beguiling. And one of the ways I do that is to kind of, when I talk, I teach a unit on the transformation of work. And when it comes to talk about technology, I offer the everyday example. And this is a true story. It's in New York. If you commit a traffic violation in New York, say you park in front of a fire hydrant, the traffic warden or the cop spots it and enters your registration details into his or her PDA. And this is the true bit, and the amazing bit, the information is then transferred by satellite to Ghana. And in Ghana, through the night, workers work on the sanctions for the penalty you will receive for that traffic violation. They send the information back to New York, and in the morning, the sanctions are sent out, the bills are sent out to the offending drivers. What connectivity or what? So I mean, people see that, and you think, New York, Ghana, Ghana, New York. And I'm actually offering this as an example of the limitations of the connectivity. Because if you think about this and the technological possibilities it brings, it reveals the limitations. How much more of that function can be moved and shipped to Ghana? The market for the activity is New York. The surveillance of the activity is based in New York. Can you imagine the Americans giving the Ghana workers access to the satellites so they can perform surveillance of New York streets? I don't think so. Can you imagine even the possibility, they can't even bill people from Ghana. They have to send the information back to New York in order to send out the bill because of details. So only a very, very small part of the process is done with the Ghanaian workers. In some ways, it reveals the institutional barriers to further expanding and moving elsewhere these labor processes. So the idea of technology as some kind of autonomous process that drives everything in its wake, regardless of institutional, social, or other aspects of life, I think is one of the things we have to avoid. Similarly with technological determinism. It's the classic features of discussions on sociology of work. Still hugely important. We just heard from Jill about 0 hours contracts workers in the care sector. And you can't really say that's got to do with technology. What you can say is to do with outsourcing because of the pressures on public spending on local authorities to provide care services. So to say that these things happen because of technology, in a very, very mechanistic and deterministic way, and that everything happens is to do with technology, I think is far from the truth. I'm not to say that technology hasn't got a role to play. It's very important in, for instance, surveillance of the labor process. But to say it actually fundamentally transforms employment relations is a step too far. Which brings us on to the question, when we construct the big picture, how do we make sensible generalization? There was a piece of research reported in the BBC about 18 months ago. Apparently in Britain there are 13,000 people working in slave conditions in this country. So we got 13,000 slaves in 2015. If you were to generalize from that to the broader labour market, it would be a false generalization, I think. If you are, so generalizing from the margins is a very, very tricky thing. However, you also have to understand how disadvantage is concentrated in particular sectors. One of the things we have to do, I think, one of the things that makes difficult the business of looking at statistics on an aggregate level is the way in which a lack of opportunity, unemployment, disadvantage is concentrated in particular sectors. Now, one of the things I think we don't take enough cognizance of is that the position of young people and how it impacts upon labour market statistics. Take, for instance, in Greece just now, the employment rate is 50%. 50% of the workforce are employed. The employment rate of people in Greece between the age of 16 and 24 is 13%. 13% employment rate in Greece. I mean, 13% is a bad unemployment rate. So as an employment rate is extraordinary. So you see the difficulties about how the youth labour market might potentially distort national statistics. And so I will offer both national aggregate statistics for the whole labour force in a minute, and also those which are 25 and upwards to see what happens. And finally, to talk about stability and insecurity. I've seen people describe my work, says, Kevin Doogan thinks there's no such thing as job insecurity. Well, I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that insecurity is not confined to or concentrated in those who are on temporary contracts. And I'm also talking about stability as a phenomenon of regularization of a long-term engagement with the labour market. Separate concepts. Having said that, let's get on to the try and justify the pretentious title. The new temporalities in the organisation of working time. Jill has done more than anybody else, along with her colleagues in Manchester, to bring attention to the organisation of working time, fractured working time, and so forth. It's not just 0 hours contracts. Brendan Birchall's also involved in forms of self-employment, which are very, very important developments. Dependent self-employment is particularly a pernicious form of employment, very similar to 0 hours contracts in many ways. So we have these new temporalities, and hugely important to establish, to investigate and analyze. My case is that the new temporalities, there is divergent temporalities. There are trends moving in two directions. One trend towards short-term, on-call, casual work on the one hand, and on the other, to increasing job stability and long service employment. And the relative strength of trends towards impermanence and irregularity and towards stability, the relative strength of those trends will be hugely important in terms of how we discuss social differentiation, the concentration and distribution of irregular employment within the workforce. Why is it important to assess this? Some people now begin to advocate that, and I'm thinking they're overgeneralizing now. We can look at not just the care sector, accommodation and food, parcel delivery and so forth, and see what they call the emergence of the 0 hours economy, suggesting also upon that which is based a two-tier workforce. This talks about these tendencies, these new temporalities lead to polarization within the workforce. A two-tier, a growing gap between lovely and lousy jobs. And it leads to social differentiation, which has empowered Guy Standing to talk about a new class, say it with a straighter face than that, a new class that is distinct from a traditional class with a new set of interests, new set of insecurities, a precariat. So class bifurcation, if you like, is seen as the outcome of these processes. If the strength of this divergence is towards job stability, a very different set of outcomes are imagined. The analytical ballpark is not looking towards polarization, but a notion of segmentation and maybe even marginalization when it comes to the possibilities that are imagined in this. So let's try and make some kind of sense of the relative strength of both. The first thing, because everybody knows there's no jobs for life anymore, as Richard Sennett says, modern institutional restructuring is accompanied by short-term contract and episodic labor. All the doyens of social science in the last 20 years have talked about the move towards impermanence, short-termism, casualization, and so forth. I'm going to offer, there's European evidence for this, there's American evidence for this, but today I'll be talking particularly about Britain. First thing to say about the long-term trend in Britain is to lower levels of turnover within the workforce. The rate of separations, job separations, has gone down from 4.4 in 1997. Job separations are voluntary and involuntary forms of job exit. 4.4% in 97, 3.6% in 2007, and 2.6% in 2012. Quite significant falls in the rate at which people leave work. There is rising job stability. Very, very significant rises in job stability. This is a phenomenon in Europe. It's a phenomenon in the United States of America. Rising long service employment, increasing job tenure, and particularly recent times, the raising of retirement age, the age of exit from the labour market, increasing as well. This is, we're looking at men in the first instance. We're looking at 15 and upwards. There are three categories of people looking at length of service. So the three categories. One is people who've been in work up to 2 years, people who've been in work between 2 and 10 years, and people who've been in work 10 years plus. We're talking about a 22-year period from 1992 to 2014. And there are three colors here. This is the 15 plus age group. And what's interesting here is the blue is the short term, the less than 2 years in work. So increasing to some extent here, decreasing now. And these two categories of relatively and very long-term employment increasing significantly. But look what happens when it comes to length of employment for 25 years plus. See the big gap between the short term and the long term. Men 25 years and older, been with the same employer for 10 years or more, constant until about 2003, dipping a bit, and then since the recession, long-term employment increasing, both for 10 years plus and for 2 years, between 2 and 10 years. That's a very significant increase and a shift between the balance of those who are long-term and short-term employment in the workforce. But the really interesting picture is with women. This is women of all ages, length of employment. The blue figure here shows that the ratio of long-term employment of women and short-term employment of women in Britain in the early 90s was very significantly tilted towards short-term employment of women. They are significantly higher than long-term. Increases here, the short-term employment increases till 2002 and then dips and dips and dips. And what is significant here is the increase in the very long-term employment of women and the 2 years to 10 years. So the ratio of the long service employment and short-term employment of women is significantly turned around for all ages. But it's even more significant for women in the 25 plus group. What you see here, these two figures show that relatively similar proportions of long-term and short-term employment, 10 years plus and less than 2 years plus. Very significantly, a greater increase in long service employment for women. So we have job stability, we have long-term job retention taking place here. And contrary to the idea of no long-term, the pursuit of labour market flexibility in many sectors and in many instances increases job stability. Part-time employment is becoming more stable for women than full-time employment. It's a staggering thing to imagine, given the decades we've spent confused and battered by these dual labour market theories. We now have a situation in which, and this is my big reveal here, this is the full-time and part-time employment of women in the 25 plus category. This is between 1992 and 2013. It's for full-time women, job tenure is pretty constant up until the recession. When the recession happens, long service employment increases for full-time women. But look what's happening with part-time women. Women part-timers. Part-time women. I don't know, sorry. So we see here, this is less than 18 months average job tenure of a part-time worker who was female. Doesn't sound so easy to say off the roll of the tongue, but less than 18 months. Now, by 2014, we're talking about 110 months average length of a part-time job. And 2014, for the first time ever, the job tenure of part-timers is greater than full-time women. So these are extraordinary, contrary to the notion of there being a shift towards the short term, the irregular. What we're seeing is extraordinary regularization of employment. So rather than the polarization suggested by a 0 hours economy and a two-tier workforce, the larger trends suggest regularization of employment and stability. Now, one of the things we have to do, 1 minute to go, my goodness. Right, one of the things we have to do as a consequence of this is that we have to rip up dual labour market theory that supports all these kind of core and periphery ideas, primary and secondary labour markets and so forth. Generalizations that kind of bracket part-time, casual, temporary in one category and full-time permanent in the other. They're just nonsense, particularly because the part-time category is more associated with permanent employment than it is with temporary employment. Temporary part-timers constitute 3% of the workforce. They're a tiny, tiny group. But because they are linked through dual labour market categories like this, we have this concept that the temporary worker, if you like, the temporary brush tarnishes the part-time worker, and it kind of radically alters our perceptions of it. So there's the good news and the bad news in all this. I feel like the old joke about the surgeon who kind of talks to the patient coming to consciousness after the operation, and the surgeon says to the patient, "I've got some good news for you, and I've got some bad news for you. The bad news is we cut off the wrong leg, and the good news is your living's getting better." Well, there's good news and bad news with this. The bad news is that insecurity is not confined to those in temporary employment, to irregular forms of employment. There's not enough of it around to justify, and to understand the very large scale evidence of insecurity that's around there. We also have to rethink what we mean by job insecurity. Job insecurity is not a function of the kind of contract we've got by and large. It's more a function of the environment in which work takes place. It's not our connection to the labour market that's the issue. It's the market itself. That is the issue. The good news is that contrary to the dominant narratives of short-term, impermanent work, the thrust of personnel policy is towards job retention. So whilst valuing kind of job retention, you get these personnel policies which stress job losses, the need for competition, the threats to relocate, the uncertainty of marketing conditions and funding, and the funding environment, personnel policy and employers still, these figures don't happen as an accident. Employers, don't retain people as an accident. It happens purposefully. The retention is something that is desired on the part of employers. And given the priority to retain the bargaining position of labour, given that labour retention is a priority for employers, the bargaining position of labour would be greatly strengthened if there's a greater realisation and appreciation of the fact that not everything is governed by impermanence, not everything is governed by temporariness, and that the bargaining position of labour is much, much more bolstered, I think, by the fact that their continued employment by the companies and by the public services is an important ambition. So there's two sorts of, if you like, implicitly, there's a valuing of labour retention, although the day-to-day conduct of employers, of managers, is to stress the vulnerability of the workplace. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.